For decades, the love story between Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett was the definition of Hollywood perfection. Two impossibly beautiful stars who seemed destined for each other. They were the golden couple of the 1970s. Lee, the rugged star of The $6 Million Man, and Farrah, the radiant Charlie's Angels icon whose poster became one of the most famous images of all time. Together, they were young, successful, and adored by millions. But behind the dazzling smiles and red carpet appearances, their marriage was quietly crumbling under the weight of fame, loneliness, and secrets that neither could outrun. Now, at 86, Lee Majors has finally broken his silence, revealing the heartbreaking truth about what really happened between him and Farrah. A truth he's carried for more than 4 decades. In rare interviews and private letters recently uncovered, Lee spoke with raw honesty about how fame tore them apart, how he struggled to be seen as more than Farrah's husband, and how their love, once fierce and genuine, slowly dissolved into regret and silence. For years, the world believed they simply drifted apart. But Lee's confessions paint a far more tragic picture, one filled with emotional distance, missed chances, and an unspoken love that never truly faded. And when Farrah's final days came, the pain of what they'd lost hit Lee harder than anyone ever imagined. What Lee Majors revealed near the end of his life wasn't just a confession. It was an emotional reckoning with the love of his life, and the devastating truth he could never admit until now. In the mid-1970s, when television ruled the American living room, there was perhaps no couple more adored than Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett. They were the epitome of glamour, the handsome all-American hero, and the breathtakingly beautiful Texas girl whose smile could light up a room. When they married in 1973, the press hailed it as a perfect union. To the world, they looked unstoppable. Lee was starring in the hit series The $6 Million Man, while Farrah's career was about to explode with Charlie's Angels. But what the cameras didn't capture was that fame was already beginning to draw an invisible wedge between them. At first, their love was simple and sincere. Friends recalled that Lee was deeply protective of Farrah, often calling her during shoots just to hear her voice. He admired her innocence and humility, despite her growing fame. But Hollywood has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. As Lee's show dominated television ratings, Farrah began to rise in popularity through commercials and magazine spreads. Suddenly, she wasn't just Lee Majors' wife. She was a star in her own right. While Lee was proud of her success, his demanding shooting schedule and constant travel meant they were rarely together. Farrah's career, too, was picking up speed, and the couple's once cozy home in Bel Air started to feel more like a hotel room, a place to visit briefly before heading back to work. According to close friends, Lee's jealousy wasn't about fame itself, but about losing time with the woman he loved most. He felt like Hollywood was stealing her, one insider later recalled. By 1976, Farrah's poster, the now iconic red swimsuit photo, turned her into a global phenomenon overnight. Every college dorm, every teenage boy's wall had her face on it. With that level of attention came rumors, relentless paparazzi, and growing tension at home. Lee struggled with the newfound spotlight on his wife, feeling his identity as a husband slowly overshadowed by Farrah's rising celebrity. Still, he tried to remain supportive, even introducing her to producers and directors who could help her career. But as both careers soared, the emotional distance widened. Their schedules rarely overlapped, and when they did, exhaustion often replaced affection. Farrah later admitted in an interview that she felt lonely, not because Lee didn't love her, but because they were living in two different worlds. "We were like ships passing in the night," she said. Hollywood's golden couple, once inseparable, began to fracture under the very spotlight that had made them famous. They weren't enemies, just two people caught in a machine far bigger than themselves. Even as their marriage started to fade, there remained a deep respect between them. Friends often said that when Farrah walked into a room, Lee's eyes would still soften. And when Lee's name came up in interviews, Farrah's tone carried quiet fondness. To the outside world, they still looked perfect, but inside, they were quietly falling apart. And as Lee Majors would later reveal in heartbreaking detail, what came next would haunt him for the rest of his life. By 1978, the once picture-perfect marriage between Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett was barely holding together. What began as two dreamers chasing success had become two separate worlds colliding under the pressure of fame. Lee was filming The Fall Guy and working grueling hours, while Farrah was juggling movie offers, photo shoots, and constant media attention. The life they had built together was now divided by work schedules, fan expectations, and an emotional gap that seemed impossible to close. Lee was old-fashioned in his love, deeply devoted, but also quietly possessive. He had grown up believing in privacy and loyalty, while Farrah was a free spirit, drawn to art, independence, and creativity. When she began exploring roles that challenged her image, Lee struggled to understand her choices. Friends described his frustration not as anger, but as fear. Fear of losing the woman he adored to a world that was always taking more than it gave. At first, they tried to fix things. Lee often flew across the country between shoots just to spend a few hours with Farrah. He sent flowers, wrote letters, and tried to remind her of the simple love they once shared. But each reunion seemed to end with another argument, another goodbye. "It wasn't that we stopped loving each other," Farrah later said in an interview. "It was that we stopped recognizing who we had become." Rumors began circulating that Farrah's growing closeness with fellow actor Ryan O'Neal had turned into something more than friendship. The tabloids exploded with speculation, painting Lee as the jealous husband and Farrah as the woman torn between two men. Though both denied the gossip at the time, insiders knew the emotional distance between Lee and Farrah had reached its breaking point. Lee Majors, heartbroken but proud, decided to let go rather than fight publicly. He filed for separation in 1979, a move that shocked fans who had seen them as Hollywood's most unshakable couple. In private, though, he never stopped caring. Years later, he confessed that even when their marriage ended, part of him hoped they might find their way back to each other someday. Farrah, meanwhile, moved forward with her career, determined to prove she was more than a pretty face. Her performances, in films like The Burning Bed and Extremities, earned her critical acclaim and redefined her as a serious actress. But behind her newfound independence, she carried deep guilt over how things ended with Lee. "He was my rock," she once admitted softly, "and I think I broke his heart." As time passed, Lee's pain turned into quiet reflection. He married, again focused on his projects, and tried to bury his feelings beneath work and routine. Yet, in interviews, he often spoke of Farrah with warmth, never bitterness. "We had our time," he said once, "and it was a beautiful time." But what the world didn't know was that Lee Majors had never truly healed from the loss. In his private letters, discovered years later by close friends, he wrote about dreams where Farrah still smiled at him, about moments he wished he could relive, and about the silence that haunted him long after she was gone. Their love story, once so bright, had dimmed quietly, not in anger, but in heartbreak. And when tragedy eventually came knocking on Farrah's door, Lee would find himself facing emotions he thought he had long buried deep inside. As the years went by, Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett lived separate lives, each carving out their own path in Hollywood. Yet, Even as decades passed, the emotional bond they once shared never truly disappeared. Whenever their names appeared in the headlines, they were still linked, not as exes, but as a memory of what love once looked like in its purest form. Still, when tragedy struck years later, it forced Lee to confront a pain he had never fully faced. In 2006, Farrah was diagnosed with anal cancer, a battle that would soon dominate her final years. The world watched as the once vibrant actress grew frail, but never lost her spirit. While fans prayed for her recovery, Lee remained silent, choosing to grieve privately. Close friends later revealed that he had been devastated by the news. Though they had not spoken in years, he quietly reached out through mutual acquaintances, sending his prayers and support. But Farrah, too weak and emotionally drained, never responded directly. Their silence in those final months spoke volumes. It wasn't resentment that kept them apart, it was the weight of everything unspoken. Lee had long blamed himself for the cracks that had formed in their marriage, the long absences, the misunderstandings, and the pride that kept him from reaching out sooner. Now, as Farrah's condition worsened, he found himself haunted by what-ifs. What if he'd been there when she needed him? What if they had one last conversation before it was too late? When Farrah passed away on June 25, 2009, at the age of 62, Lee Majors was shattered. That same day, the world was also mourning the death of Michael Jackson, whose passing dominated headlines. But for Lee, the only loss that mattered was Farrah's. He released a brief, heartfelt statement, just a few lines. But those close to him said he spent days in seclusion afterward, quietly, reflecting on their years together. In an interview years later, Lee admitted that he never stopped thinking about her. "You don't really move on from a love like that," he said softly. "You just learn to live with the ache." It was one of the few times he publicly acknowledged the depth of his feelings since their separation. After her death, Lee reconnected with some of Farrah's old friends and colleagues, sharing memories of her laughter, her kindness, and her unwavering strength. He even attended private gatherings held in her honor, quietly slipping in and out, avoiding cameras and attention. For him, it wasn't about publicity, it was about closure. Perhaps the most emotional moment came when Lee watched Farrah's story, the documentary she had filmed during her cancer battle. Seeing her courage, her honesty, and her refusal to give up brought tears to his eyes. "That was the woman I fell in love with," he told a friend. "She was always stronger than people realized." Lee Majors had loved many times in his life, but Farrah Fawcett was different. She was his first great love, the one that defined his youth, shaped his career, and stayed in his heart long after their paths diverged. In her passing, he lost not just a former wife, but a piece of himself. And though the world remembered her for her beauty and fame, Lee remembered her for something far simpler. The way she used to laugh at his bad jokes, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about Texas, and the warmth she carried even on her darkest days. For Lee, the final goodbye to Farrah was more than just an ending. It was the quiet acceptance that love, no matter how fleeting, leaves an imprint that time can never erase. For years after Farrah Fawcett's death, Lee Majors kept his silence. He avoided interviews that mentioned her, never wrote a tell-all memoir, and rarely spoke publicly about their relationship. To the world, it seemed like he had finally moved on, content with his quiet life away from Hollywood. But behind that calm exterior, Lee carried a truth he had never shared, a truth that only in his later years he felt ready to admit. He never stopped loving her. At 86 years old, Lee finally opened up in a rare interview, reflecting on the woman who had defined so much of his life. His voice, now older and gentler, carried both pride and sorrow as he spoke. "People always ask if I regret anything," he said. "And the truth is, I regret letting her walk away without telling her how much I still loved her." He revealed that their marriage, though brief, was the most formative period of his life. Farrah's warmth, ambition, and kindness had left an indelible mark on him. "She had this light," Lee said. "Even in her hardest moments, she never let darkness win. That's what made her so special." Lee admitted that his biggest mistake was letting fame and work come between them. He had been so focused on success that he forgot what mattered most. "We were both chasing dreams," he reflected. "But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of each other." The pain in his voice was unmistakable as he described how he wished he'd been by her side in her final days. "I should have been there," he confessed softly. "Not as an ex-husband, just as someone who once loved her more than life itself." It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had spent his life playing strong, stoic heroes on screen. But this time, he was speaking from his heart, not from a script. Those who knew Lee say he still keeps a photo of Farrah in his home. Not from her Charlie's Angels days, but a candid one taken before fame consumed their lives. In the picture, they're laughing together, carefree and young. "That's how I choose to remember her," Lee once said, before everything got complicated, before Hollywood got in the way. In his later years, Lee also expressed admiration for how Farrah handled her illness. Watching her courage in her final documentary deeply moved him. He told close friends that her bravery reminded him of the woman he fell in love with. Strong, determined, and full of heart. "She faced death the same way she faced life," he said. "Head on, with grace." As he grows older, Lee Majors has come to terms with the bittersweet truth that his story with Farrah wasn't meant to last forever, but it was meant to matter. He finally admitted that she was, and always would be, the love of his life. "Some people come into your world and never really leave," he said. "Farrah was that person for me." Fans who heard his words were deeply moved. It wasn't a grand confession or a dramatic revelation. It was an honest human moment from a man who had spent a lifetime carrying silent pain. For Lee Majors, the devastating truth wasn't about betrayal or scandal. It was about love, pure, imperfect, and unforgettable. And now, as time slows and memories fade, one thing remains certain. Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett's story will forever be remembered as one of Hollywood's most beautiful and heartbreaking romances. A love that burned brightly, ended too soon, and lingered in the heart of a man who never stopped wishing he'd said one last goodbye.